Hi, this is Elizabeth with World's Cup of Joe, Awaken Your Soul. Welcome to our Sunday Soul Love Through Literature series. This series discusses twin flame connections found in literature. We are continuing the first book in this series, which is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. In this series, we try to dissect if Jane Eyre is the runner in a twin flame connection, while her love interest and employer, Mr. Rochester, is the push or positive polarity. I will continue to lay out my reasoning and argument that they are in fact in a twin flame connection. See if you agree with me. Feel free to comment below whether it's on this series or if there are other novels you have read that scream twin flame to you. We love to hear from you. And now let us recap episode 5. In part 5 of this series, a new twist has occurred in the plot. Jane wakes to a horrible premonition that something was wrong with Mr. Rochester. She overhears a queer laughter and heads to Mr. Rochester's chamber where she finds his room on fire. She immediately puts on her hero cap and rushes to find a basin to fill with water so she can douse the fire out of his room. She tries to wake him up, but finds he is somewhat passed out until she throws water on him. Once she explains what has transpired, Mr. Rochester hails her his cherished preserver and doesn't want her to leave his energy. He holds onto her hand even though she comes up with multiple excuses to go back to her room. Finally, he releases her and allows her to take leave of him. And this is where we start this episode. Now, let me set the stage for today's episode. Jane continues to develop her feelings for Mr. Rochester. We also learn more about that weird occurrence regarding the fire that was set. Jane thinks that the villain is an employee named Mrs. Grace Poole. She is convinced that it is her, but doesn't understand why Mr. Rochester won't hold her accountable for her potential assassination on his life. She even finds herself getting jealous of the idea that he could potentially be romantically interested in this woman. After those thoughts, she finds herself unable to stop thinking about him and desiring to see him. She is hoping for time to spend with him, but she finds out he has gone to a friend's house about 10 miles away and may be gone for up to a week. She also finds out that there may be women at this party that may catch his eye, and she finds herself jealous again. Now, let us begin. Quote 1. I both wished and feared to see Mr. Rochester on the day that followed this sleepless night. I wanted to hear his voice again, yet feared to meet his eye. Jane Eyre. Did the bubble phase begin for Jane, or has Mr. Rochester returned to soul? What is the bubble phase in a twin flame connection? Well, this simply means that even though the positive polarity may push or display addictive energies, it isn't enough to repel the negative polarity. That doesn't happen until soul recognition. That is when the negative polarity can no longer be around their twin when in mind. Mind energy becomes so toxic that they physically cannot be around their twin, and they don't understand the full reasoning as to why. If you remember from the previous episode, after Jane saves Mr. Rochester, he had completely gone into mind, and Jane needed to leave his space. But this morning she wakes up and all she wants to do is see him. So were they in the bubble phase, or was Mr. Rochester in soul? Well, it could be both. We will find out later that Mr. Rochester goes away to a friend's house, which is him focusing on himself and what he wants, which is soul. But I still think that the bubble phase is going on because the full repelling doesn't happen until later in the book. More on that in a later episode. What we do know is that Jane is smitten with Mr. Rochester, and all she wants is to be near him again. All mind energy of the evening before erased from her memory. Joanne and I always compare mind energy to scribbles on a dry erase board. As soon as the positive polarity is back into soul mode, it's like the dry erase board has been wiped clean in terms of how the negative polarity sees their twin. All is forgotten. They are now in the present moment of soul. Next quote. Had Grace been young and handsome, I should have been tempted to think that tenderer feelings than prudence or fear influenced Mr. Rochester in her behalf. But hard-favored and matronly as she was, the idea could not be admitted. Here's the first of a few quotes where Jane is in mind, not understanding what Mr. Rochester sees in Grace Poole. She is going back and forth with mind, trying to determine what his intentions are towards Mrs. Poole, and in the process making herself jealous of this woman that she has already noted is not someone she would feel was up to Mr. Rochester's standards. Next quote. Mr. Rochester is an amateur of the decided and eccentric. Grace is eccentric at least. Going back and forth, she thinks, what if he likes Mrs. Poole because she's eccentric? This comparison she is doing is more reminiscent of what a push polarity goes through than a pull. A push polarity will often compare themselves to others and feel inferior and extreme jealousy towards anyone they feel could be a threat to their connection. It's not to say that the pull polarity can't experience feelings or moments of jealousy. My person has told me on many occasions that he can be a jealous person, but he keeps those emotions under lock and key, comparative to me. Next quote. No, impossible. My supposition cannot be correct. Yet, suggested the secret voice which talks to us in our hearts, you are not beautiful either, and perhaps Mr. Rochester approves you. At any rate, you have often felt as if he did, and last night, remember his words, remember his look, remember his voice. I included this quote not only to show you the mind energy that Jane is waging in her thoughts towards Mr. Rochester, but to demonstrate the power of thoughts. She even talks about the voice inside our heads. She calls it the secret voice. We have learned that the mind is not us. We are not our thoughts, nor our actions. We are soul. But Jane doesn't know that about herself since she is asleep. She believes that she is the secret voice which talks to us in our hearts. Jane recognizes that she is not beautiful, but has this feeling that Mr. Rochester still likes her. She feels it. She feels it in his words, in his look, in his voice. This is not surprising as the pull polarity. She would associate his interest in her with her senses, since the pull sees the push through presence. Look at what she indicates. Sound and sight to tell her that he likes her. What she does not understand is that she feels the energy of him and that this is how she knows that he likes her. Next quote. I hastened to drive from my mind the hateful notion I had been conceiving respecting Grace Poole. It disgusted me. I compared myself with her and found we were different. Let me point out that despite Jane showing her jealousy in this line, it also speaks to her being the negative polarity at the same time. Let me point out that she says she hastened to drive this thought from her mind. Let's be real. If she was the positive polarity, there is no way she could quickly rid this thought from her head. She'd be ruminating on it for days. Isn't that right, my fellow positive polarities out there? Jane can recognize the feeling of jealousy that has stirred within her and hates the story her mind has created regarding Grace Poole. She then goes on to say that she compared herself to her, and in the next few sentences goes on to say she thinks herself more worthy for Mr. Rochester than Grace. This passage highlights the stark contrast between a push and a pull. The pull may still exhibit jealousy feelings, but they will not sit and ruminate on those emotions the way a push polarity will. Before I introduce the next quote, Jane has just found out that Mr. Rochester has left the home and may be gone for up to a week to get together with other wealthy people. Listen to one of the first questions that Jane asked Mrs. Fairfax about the event he will be attending. Are there ladies at the Lays? I would say that law of attraction is at play in this question. Think about it. Jane just rid herself of the thoughts of Grace Poole and the emotions of jealousy that they brought. And what was the first emotion that popped back up when she found out Mr. Rochester was attending this get-together? Jealousy. Like brings about like energy. She responded to Grace with jealousy, and that emotion was still her dominant vibration. I know from the push polarity's perspective, I was constantly in a lower vibration of jealousy before separation. It didn't matter who it was, I was jealous. And now knowing what I do, it was the addictive energy mixed with the consistent vibration being dominant in my experience all the time. It kept attracting more things for me to get jealous over. Next quote. When once more alone, I reviewed the information I had got, looked into my heart, examined its thoughts and feelings, and endeavored to bring back with a strict hand such as had been straying through imagination's boundless and trackless waste into the safe fold of common sense. I love this quote. How practical those polarities are. She went back to her room, thought logically about her emotions, and came back to common sense. So let me be clear. The push polarity is ruled by emotions, while the pull polarity is ruled by logic. This is one of the reasons both Joanne's person and my person will never believe any TF stuff. Despite us making this our life mission, they will not listen, nor will it ever resonate with them. That is because they are the logical half of our soul. Jane is showing that she is also the logical half of the soul. The push is not able to brush off the emotional side of this connection and come back to common sense. That is just not how we were built. We can understand the logic behind it, but the emotions don't keep up speed to match that logic. The emotions will always dominate. Next quote. Ere long, I had reason to congratulate myself on the course of wholesome discipline to which I had thus forced my feelings to submit. Thanks to it, I was able to meet subsequent occurrences with a decent calm. I will conclude this episode with this final quote that is essentially talking about triggers. Jane has found a way in which to logically combat the jealousy she experienced through what she calls wholesome discipline. Then she goes on to say, because of it, any future occurrences that were to set her off would be met with an air of calm. I know, as the push polarity, any trigger I had was just as harsh and overwhelming as the previous. Even if I had learned how to work through the previous situation, the next one would hit me just as hard. So much so that it felt like I was continuously breaking inside. I couldn't handle triggers. There's no way I could ever echo the sentiments that Jane voiced in this quote. Even today, when I get triggered, I will say they're not quite as harsh, nor do they last as long as they once did, but they still do happen. I know a reality of this connection is that they will always occur. That's just part of this journey. Triggers are a method soul brings to help shed those unwanted stored emotions and energies that no longer serve us. Now I welcome triggers because I know they are for my own good. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Soul Love Through Literature. I hope you join us again for next week's episode of Is Jane Eyre a Twin Flame Runner?